Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 16th of December 2024. The HMRC estimates that the UK losses of around $5 billion to tax evasion, which is the most prevalent amongst small businesses. And in 2019-20, 66% of the estimated evasion losses come from small businesses, including companies, partnerships and sole traders. This figure has now risen to 81%, preventing a level playing field between businesses by giving evaders an unfair competitive advantage and depriving the public purse of its revenue. So today, we will question the department on its understanding of the tax evasion and examine its efforts to establish effective systems to take this increasingly costly issue. So today, to help us with all that, we have the following witnesses. We have Sir Jim Harra, KCB, the first Permanent Secretary and Chief Executive of HMRC. We have, and I hope I'm going to pronounce your name correctly, Penny, and please do correct me if I'm not, but I think it's pronounced Ciniewicz. Ciniewicz, it runs on. Brilliant, thank you very much. I will correct my phonetic. And we will have, and I'll explain this, and we have Dean Beale, the Chief Executive of the Insolvency Service. Dean, I think this is your first appearance, so special welcome to you. And we will have Louise Smyth, the Chief Executive and Registrar of Companies House. She is unfortunately stuck on a train at the moment and isn't expected to arrive until 4 o'clock. So what we will do is we will, I think, take a break when she arrives, just to give her a little bit of chance, as it's also her first time in front of this committee, to sort of settle down and see how the whole thing is set out and everything else. So we're not expecting to ask any direct questions in relation to Companies House until she arrives. But if it does, Sir Jim, she has offered to, and you may refer to her, of course, but if there is a conversation, she will look at the transcript and respond in writing afterwards. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask you the first question, if I may, Sir Jim, and it's about, as you remember, Ben Lake, who was the Member of Parliament, still is a Member of Parliament for Kerry, Gideon and Presili, who was a member of this committee, raised with you on at least two occasions this issue of where I think a Chinese origin company had been corresponding or sent vast numbers of letters to his address. So his address in Cardiff, he was swamped with letters. You undertook to look into this matter. You undertook that hopefully it would be sorted. But unfortunately, I have from Ben, from his constituent, via his constituent, letters dated as late as the 11th of October 2024, that this is still going on. And a letter was sent to his address from the Inland Revenue on the 11th of October, here it is, asking for a tax demand of £117,000. There had previously been, on the 18th of October, 5 different letters sent to his address from HMRC with varying tax demands for unpaid import duties and VAT of amounts varying between 82 and 646, 228, 253 and 66 pounds. So this matter is still very much continuing. Having raised this twice before, last year in the committee, and earlier this year, one really would have hoped this would have been sorted out. And I wonder if you can give Ben Lake and his constituent some good news this afternoon, Sir Jim, please.
Certainly, I'll apologise again to Mr Davies and Mr Lake for this. I think when I gave evidence before, I did say that we had put overrides on our systems to prevent automated correspondence going out to the address, but I did confess that was unlikely to be perfect, and therefore some more correspondence could get through, and I think there have been compared with the past, relatively small numbers of correspondence in the last few months, which we have investigated why that is the case, and it relates to our Customs Declaration Service overriding the override that we put in. So I do apologise for that, and we obviously are endeavouring to make sure that we don't send any more correspondence to Mr Davies's address. It isn't in relation to one company. There were in fact about 11,000 businesses that varied their registration address to 2 different addresses that had the same postcode. My understanding is the intention was that all of them would go to one of those addresses, but actually about 2,500 of them went to the other, which unfortunately was Mr. Davies's residential address, which is why he then got correspondence. Some of the companies have got VAT debts that predate the online marketplace rules coming into force in 2021, and a very small number have got customs debts, which is why our system keeps generating letters. But I do apologise that that's continuing.
There's 2 different issues here. There's various different companies using his address as their correspondence address. How do we stop that?
So there were about 11,000 businesses that submitted a variation to their VAT registration using, unfortunately, Mr. Davies's address shares a postcode with another address, which is a service office for companies, and therefore was the correct address that they wished to vary to. But unfortunately, owing to a typing error by their agent, about 2,500 of the 11,000 companies varied their registration to Mr. Davies's address instead. As I say, we have put a block in on our VAT system to try and ensure that it does not send any more automated correspondence to Mr. Davies, but we have a number of other systems that have got address data from various stages. So unfortunately, I did tell him that we may not be able to stop it all, but each time it happens, we are investigating and putting.
Then there's the other issue of your own systems. Mm-hmm. Surely it would be possible to just send out an alert to every part of your organisation, say, look, we've got this case. This address is not to be used for any more correspondence. And as I say, whilst I can understand that some of the old legacy companies might still be using that address, and you may not be able to stop them because they're companies, you should surely be able to stop your own organisation sending letters which don't concern him in any way.
Well, we have tried very hard to do so, but unfortunately there are 65,000 people in the organisation. They change from time to time. If these most recent incidents did involve manual processes as opposed to automated ones, so it is a matter of educating all of our officers that in this instance there's an override.
I want to try once more, because I don't think that is a satisfactory reply. I really do think in your own organisation, if you're digitally wired up, as I hope you are sufficiently, you should be able to send an email around to every bit of your department to say, this has happened, please under no circumstances send any correspondence to this address. Well, I think you owe that to this poor person who's getting these thousands of letters. It's not his fault. If I were a citizen, I'd be hopping mad. I think he and his MP have been very courteous and very patient with all of this.
They have indeed, Chair. I mean, I will take away what more we can do to remind officers not to use the address, but obviously our officers, they may come across this once and forget the fact that some months earlier they've been asked not to use that address, but I do apologise that it has continued.
The apology is accepted, but what we really want is action so it doesn't happen anymore. Anyway, I've said enough, and that's fair enough, and thank you for addressing that. I just want to raise 2 issues, not really to get an answer from you, but one is the change in the budget, which has reduced the threshold for making tax digital down to 20,000, which is by the end of this Parliament, which is quite a low threshold and quite a compliance burden for a lot, I would imagine, of very small businesses, many of whom don't have an accounts department, let alone an accountant. They probably do it themselves at midnight. Can I just ask you to exercise that change with the lightest possible touch?
Thank you, Chair. So it's been announced in principle that change will be brought in, but there are no details yet about when. It will be after initial cohorts have been brought into making tax digital for income tax, so we will have learned a lot of lessons by the time that lower turnover cohort joins the programme, but I take what you say.
Thank you very much. I think Lloyd Hatton wants to talk about his hairdressing businesses. Well, not only his, but all of our hairdressing businesses.
Indeed, all of ours. Thank you, Chair. And to feed on from that point, I mean, when I was studying for my GCSEs and still had a full head of hair, there were approximately 25,000 hair and beauty businesses in the country. Now, today, that number stands at around double, approximately 50,000 hair and beauty businesses. And yet the number of businesses in that sector that are registered for VAT has essentially flatlined. So I was just wondering if you could start, Sir Jim, by just telling us, are you not at all concerned by those figures, that we've seen this huge increase in the number of overall businesses, but not really any increase at all in the number registered for VAT?
Well, there is obviously a turnover threshold for registering for VAT, so if businesses are small and operate below that threshold, they will not have to register, and the government obviously keeps that threshold under review. And in recent years, it has variously been frozen. I think it was increased by £5,000 last year, but is now frozen again. And therefore, over time, you would expect more and more businesses to come within the ambit of VAT. But obviously, if the turnover is legitimately below the threshold, then we don't expect the business to register.
I suppose, Sir Jim, that's the main concern of this committee, and the Hairdressing Council have submitted written information for this committee to consider, which raises their specific concerns around the rent-a-chair model, which looks to split workers into individual self-employed entities, which then essentially keeps those businesses always below the VAT threshold, which you just mentioned. Their concern is that actually this is often a way for individuals to avoid paying tax aggressively or even evade paying tax. There are also considerable concerns, which I appreciate sit outside the remit of HMRC, that actually this model could be used for other forms of economic crime as well, perhaps money laundering. So again, I would be really grateful if you could offer us reassurances to the Hairdressing Council that you are looking at this area, because it could be the case that this sector is in fact a kind of a new hotspot for tax avoidance, tax evasion and other forms of economic crime.
Yeah, so I think there are two specific tax risks in play there. One is sort of artificially depressing turnover below the VAT threshold, and that is something that we actively police, and it's part of our hidden economy work and our estimate of the hidden economy in the tax gap. The other is the dividing line between employment and self-employment. The rent-a-chair model is very long-standing in the hair and beauty industry, and provided it is done correctly, then it will give rise to self-employment rather than employment. And there are obviously incentives within the tax system for people to be self-employed. But that, again, is a dividing line in the tax system that we very actively police.
Just one final question there. It would be great if you could offer reassurances to the Hairdressing Council, and I've had a barber in my constituency in Weymouth, South Dorset, raise this specific concern. I think the legitimate businesses who are doing the right thing and pay their VAT and all their other taxes on the side, I think would be keen to know exactly what and when action will be taken by HMRC. I think the council deserve that information as soon as possible. So if you could give us at least an overview today, that would be very helpful.
So I agree. Obviously, we are pursue non-compliance for two reasons. First of all, because we want the tax that is due, but also because we want to create a level playing field for compliant businesses. So that's a very important sort of driver for us of our activity. I can reassure the council that both non-compliance with the VAT threshold, but also non-compliance with the dividing line between employment and self-employment are risks that we focus on and that we devote significant resource to.
Thank you very much, Lloyd Haddon. Sarah Olney on digital marketplaces, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sir Jim, eBay UK are headquartered in my constituency, Richmond Park, and I had a meeting with them last week about some of their concerns around the application of the new rules for tax reporting for online marketplaces. Their specific issue is that now when they need to register all new sellers need to provide their tax information at the point when they make their first sale. But this is in spite of the fact that many of them are householders just looking to dispose of used items. And I wondered if you could comment on the fact that this is actually providing a bit of a suppressing effect. As I say, these are ordinary individuals, they're not traders. We will come on later, I think, to the dangers of overseas sellers using online marketplaces. But specifically for UK citizens who want to use an online marketplace but are being deterred because of the way that these rules are being administered. I'd be grateful if you could just give your view as to why it's necessary to get the tax information up front from people who may only be making 1 or 2 sales a year.
So the new rules have not come into effect yet. I think it's next month that they begin to apply. They don't change anyone's tax liability. What they do is provide for the marketplaces to provide information to HMRC, which we will use for compliance risk assessment purposes. We have made a lot of effort to reassure people who sell unwanted items on eBay and other platforms, and therefore will not have a tax liability, that they've got nothing to be concerned about with these rules. And indeed, in the last couple of weeks, we've generated quite a bit of media coverage in advance of the new rules coming in to try and reassure people that if you're selling your own second-hand goods, clothes that your children have grown out of or whatever, you don't need to worry about tax. And there are also de minimis limits built into the reporting requirements, so we won't get information about every small sale. It's only where there are a significant number of sales or sales over a certain amount that we will get the information. And obviously we'll keep that under review. If there's evidence that people are unnecessarily worrying about that, we will try to do more to reassure people. It will be important when we get data from the marketplaces that it's in a format that we can match to people's records, because that will help us to target our work, meaning that we can be more likely to inquire into non-compliant taxpayers and be less likely to inquire into compliant taxpayers. So, we have been working with the marketplaces to make sure that they keep their data in a format that will support that.
But you're asking the marketplaces to collect data from people who are never going to be taxpayers or never going to be required to pay tax on these sales. Would it not be better to have, to only require marketplaces to collect the data when they know that a tax liability is going to emerge?
Well, that's something I think we can keep under review. I'm not close enough to it, and Penny may have more information, but I suspect that, at the point where a new seller is registering with the marketplace, we've concluded that that's the best time to collect the information from them, when neither we nor the marketplace will know what their pattern of sales is going to be in the future, and that may well be sort of more administratively convenient for the marketplace and the sellers than for them to have to go along and get information from people subsequently when they analyse the pattern of sales. But I do appreciate that there's been a lot of controversy about this change and worry about its impact, and it hasn't actually come into force yet, so we will need to keep very careful monitoring of how it's going.
I think we've got a lot to get through. We'll leave it there, but if you would undertake, Sir Jim, please, to keep this matter closely under review and see what more publicity you can give it, so that people are not artificially deterred from using digital marketplaces like eBay, would be really helpful.
Well, indeed, Chair.
Thank you very much. Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Good afternoon. So many small businesses on the high street in my constituency of Shipley are expressing concern about illegally imported tobacco and vape products. So a shop owner I met with recently told me that by avoiding the import duties, other shops were undercutting him and his legally sold products. Illegal cigarettes and vapes were sold during 4 out of 5 of every trading standards test purchases in the Bradford area last year. So this is clearly a very significant local and potentially national issue. So I'd like to know what progress the HMRC are making in reducing high street sales of illicit tobacco and vape products, if you're able to help with that, Sir Jim.
Yes, thank you. So we have long experience of tackling the importation and sale of illicit tobacco products, so cigarettes and hand-rolling tobacco, smuggling being the main risk, but sometimes UK production as well. And of course there are strong incentives in the tax system for criminals to engage in that because of the very high tax rates involved with tobacco. In the case of vaping products, that has not really been the case so much in the tax system, because until now, they've been subject to VAT like every other product, but there's been no special tax rules for them. But from October 2026, there will be a new vaping products duty as well, which means that the similar kinds of incentives for them will start, as is the case with tobacco. We have successfully reduced the tobacco gap. So, for example, it was 15.1% in 2019-20 and has been reduced to 14.5% in 22-23, but that is still significantly higher than some other parts of the tax gap. So it's a particular focus for us and Border Force, who obviously administer risks at the border. Some of the other impacts of these products are not tax related, but trading standards, for example, are interested in them, and we do work in in close cooperation with trading standards. Particularly, we try to manage the risk throughout the supply chain. So we have fiscal crime liaison officers embedded in UK missions in countries overseas where the supply chain starts, right through to the retail end in the UK where we cooperate with trading standards. I think it has taken us many years to build the process for managing this risk in relation to tobacco, and we have and that's quite a highly regulated industry. So there are particular compliance risks with vaping products as the new duty comes on board, and that is currently a relatively fragmented industry. But there is a national strategy of which we are part, along with DEFRA and the Department for Health and Social Care, which is about regulating that market, and hopefully we'll be able to use new licensing rules, for example, to leverage them to help us with tax compliance as well.
Thank you. Do you have a target for reducing that further from the 14 down, the tobacco gap?
We don't specifically have a target for any part of the tax gap, but because of the size of that and also the fact that we're not just talking about collecting revenues here, we're also talking about the health benefits. That's the reason why the duty is so high. It is a priority area for us, along with Border Force and our partners.
And can you translate that into numbers, cash numbers?
Can we leave it there?
Yep.
We may correspond with you about this further, but we're sort of 20 odd minutes in and we haven't started the main session yet.
Thank you,
so, Clive Betts.
Right, good afternoon, Sir Jim, on to the very main part of the agenda. Your estimate of the scale of tax evasion. Are you actually confident of the figure of around 5 billion, or is it a guesstimate rather than an estimate?
It's our best estimate. So the tax gap measure is our best estimate with the data available at the time when we make the estimate of the overall tax gap, and then we do revise it subsequently when more data comes to light. Once we start to break down the overall tax gap into different behavioural types, the level of uncertainty clearly grows. But in the case of evasion, we take the data that we have, but also we apply sort of expert judgment to adjusting it. For example, we tend to adjust it upwards from what the raw data shows, to take account of the fact that some evasion doesn't get identified as evasion during the investigation process. So it is our best estimate.
Do you revise your estimates upwards when you become more aware of the evasion that's been happening? You probably are successful in prosecutions or engagement with taxpayers.
Yes, I mean, I'll give you two examples of when we revise our estimates after the event. I mean, first of all, some of our estimates, particularly the VAT gap, is a top-down estimate based on economic data from the Office of National Statistics about the level of consumption in the economy. When the ONS publishes revised economic data after we've made our estimate, we will then revise our estimate accordingly. Some of it is a bottom-up build from a random inquiry programs that we carry out. We will make an estimate at the point in time when it's due for publication, but when cases subsequently settle and that requires an adjustment to it, then we do that. We will do it upward or downward as it requires.
Right. So it's obviously a big number, whatever the number precisely is, but you haven't got a strategy to tackle it. I think most people will be quite surprised at that.
We have an overall compliance strategy. It's built of three legs, which are prevent, promote, respond. So we aim through controls in our systems to prevent non-compliance, whether that be evasion or other types of non-compliance. Then we aim to educate and promote good compliance by people, and finally we will respond to non-compliance where we can find it, and we've got risk assessment to do that. And in fact, most of our activity is in the respond area. In addition, we've got, whilst the tax gap measure tells us how much non-compliance there is, it often doesn't tell us what the risks are that are creating that non-compliance. So in addition, we have, for operational purposes, a strategic picture of risk. So we identify all the major risks that are driving the tax gap, and then we have a risk treatment program for those, and we deploy our resources against them. And then on top of that, we've got sort of specific strategic approaches to particular types of non-compliance. So we've got an approach to serious fraud, to avoidance, and I've mentioned we've got a specific strategy in relation to tobacco, but we don't have a specific strategy in relation to the evasion element of it.
I think that most of us will be quite surprised that as a big issue, that isn't something you've got a particular focus on, because it means as well, doesn't it, that you haven't got an absolute explicit objective of what you should be achieving in your in tackling tax evasion. You haven't got a target, you haven't got a particular view as to where you should be getting to with all the work you're doing.
We have, we're driven by a key target, which is a compliance yield target, which is designed to close the tax gap. And we have successfully reduced the tax gap from 7.4% in 2005-06 to 4.8% in 22-23.
Yeah, I understand that, but why not have a specific objective on tax evasion? It's a big issue. It's something nobody wants to see. So why not just focus on that as a particular issue?
Well, it is one element of the tax gap, and we want to tackle all elements of it. We've got a general strategy that applies to tax evasion, but applies equally to other parts of the tax gap as well.
Don't you think that it might be a good idea to have a strategy?
I think that is something that we need to look at, to the extent that the behaviour requires a particular response which doesn't work for, where other types of response don't work for that particular behaviour, then yes, we would want to make sure that we have that. So I think it's something we keep under review. But having strategies for, you can slice and dice the tax gap in myriad ways, and we can't have lots and lots of different strategies for different types of it. We have to be able to deploy our resources across the whole of the tax gap and apply approaches that work for us.
Right. I think the committee might like to see, perhaps in next year, that you've had a look at the strategy, had a think about it, and maybe reconsidered.
Yes, certainly. There's a recommendation from the National Audit Office that we look at that, and we will be responding to that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Clive. That's very, very helpful. Rachel Gilmore, please.
From what you've just said, it therefore follows quite logically that if effectively what HMRC is saying is that you are willing to tolerate a degree of tax evasion, would you be able to put a figure on that level of tolerance?
I don't think that is what I intended to say, and we certainly don't have a level of tolerance. No tax evasion, or indeed no non-compliance, is acceptable to us. I think it is inevitable that there will always be some. We want to drive the tax gap down as low as we possibly can, and as I say, we have successfully driven it down from 7.4% in 2005-06 to 4.8% in the most recent year that we've measured it, and it's been, we've been keeping it low for several years now, but we want to drive it down further, and the government has announced significant investment in the department in the budget at the end of October, which will enable us to bring in an additional £6.5 billion a year by 29-30 compared with previously, and that should continue the downward pressure on the tax gap, including the evasion element of it.
Yeah, hopefully a strategy will help. So now that your objective is to reduce the tax gap, will the strategy be the way out, or how will this affect the way you approach tax evasion?
So the government announced in the budget a number of measures. There are some policy measures to strengthen the protection and controls within the tax gap. There is some investment in our systems and our data, but most significantly there is investment in additional staffing for HMRC, in Penny's customer compliance group, and also in our debt management group. And taken together, all of that should enable us to achieve that £6.5 billion additional tax revenues by 29-30.
And my next question does go to Penny Ciniewicz, is that right? I have a relatively poor constituency, and there's very few things that are more distressing that when one, having quite rightly filled out one's tax returns, gets a bill that you know to be inaccurate, then it takes ages and ages and ages to get the right bill. So I'd like to know, with that background, do you put more emphasis on reducing unintended non-compliance, such as that resulting from human error?
So in terms of tax bills, I think my teams are actually more on the investigation end of the work in HMRC, but the strategy, that overarching strategy that Jim has described of promote, prevent, respond, is really designed in the promotion end of it to help people get their tax right and to prevent people getting it wrong by making it as easy as possible for people to get their tax right. And a lot of the investment will be about trying to make our systems easier for people to interact with, to help them. And also we put quite a lot of money and time into educating taxpayers and supporting taxpayers to get their tax right. It is a really important part of the strategy.
Will that include really basic things like having staff who will answer a phone within an hour and be able to give accessible advice? Because I think the lack of a human face at HMRC at the moment is something that people comment on, that, you know, it's, if you've got 3.5 hours to spare to hang on to the end of the phone, you might get some advice, but if you haven't, you know, you have to walk away with the anxiety. So it would certainly reassure myself and my constituents in Tiverton and Minehead if they knew that maybe a commitment to answer the telephone within half an hour would be part of that new regime.
Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate that our customer service levels in the last couple of years have not been good enough, although you know, we're certainly not taking that length of time to, you know, 3 hours to answer calls. At the moment, the average wait time is about 11 to 12 minutes, and that has significantly reduced over the summer. And since the beginning of October, we have now been hitting our service standard for our helplines. But I appreciate that has not been the case for the first half of this year or the preceding couple of years in particular.
Okay.
I think the issue on customer service, we covered that fairly well in a previous hearing.
Okay, sorry, Geoffrey.
No, have you dealt with everything you want to deal with?
Yeah, that's me done.
Thank you very much. Peter Fortune.
Thank you very much. Jim, you mentioned there about the investment to raise another 6.5 billion. 1.4 billion worth of investment is in new staff. There's 5,000 new staff coming on stream. 200 were due to start in November?
Yes, that's correct. So the government has also given us about £12 million extra funding in the current financial year to get started on that. So just over 200 of those 5,000 additional staff joined us on the 25th of November, and we expect to bring in about another 300 before the end of this financial year. So we're making a start towards building up that 5,000.
That'll still leave about 4,500 to find. When will they be ready, do you think? And where are they coming from? Where are you finding that level of staff from? Is it all new staff or is it redeployments, I guess?
So these are new jobs. About 2/3 of the recruits that joined us on the 25th of November were from outside HMRC. About 1/3 applied for the jobs from another part of HMRC. But it is Penny's area, if you want
yes.
to.
So it is the case that we do see colleagues who wish to progress their careers, perhaps moving into compliance work and coming to train to be compliance officers, and that's long been the case, and actually that's quite helpful, as well as having a mix of skills from outside and new people into the department. We already had a plan to recruit to maintain the level of people in compliance, and we'll be additionally recruiting around 1,000 people a year over the next few years to build up to that additional 5,000.
It's a multi-year project.
It's a multi-year project, yes.
Some are external, but some are internal. So the 5,000 figure of
and
staff isn't new staff.
The 5,000 will be entirely additive, I think is the best way of saying it. Some of them will move around from within HMRC to train to be compliance officers, but they will be backfilled from wherever they come from. But it's 5,000 additional staff in compliance.
Never heard additive before. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that away and use that one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
It was new to the committee too. Thank you, Peter Fortune. Lloyd Hutton, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think what would be helpful as an initial question would be why don't you monitor the tax gap by sector, particularly in relation to the online retail sector?
So we, at the moment, we don't feel that our data is good enough to be able to break it down by all the different sectors. I think we did look at a recommendation from this committee a few years ago to do that, but we concluded that in order to do it, we would have to carry out a much larger random inquiry programme to gather data that would be sufficiently granular to give you certainty across a very wide range of sectors. So what we do is we analyse it by tax and by behaviour, so the behavioural risk that drives the non-compliance. Our experience is that many of those behaviours can apply right across different sectors. So if you take evasion, which obviously is the subject of today's hearing, there's a focus in the NAO's report on retail, but it can equally be in the hospitality trade or the construction trade. So it applies across sectors, in effect.
Okay, well, I'll just park that for a second, but I do think it's quite concerning that we don't have estimates by sector, particularly for the online retail space. So sort of sitting alongside that, our last session, Sir Jim, we spoke about the offshore tax gap. And I think if I've got the transcript in front of me here, you described the estimate from HMRC as uncertain and that there is no official estimate of how much that is. I think those were both your words. So what I find concerning there is that alongside the fact that we don't really have any idea what's going on in terms of evasion, avoidance or tax planning in the online retail sector, we also don't really have a clear picture of the offshore tax gap as well. So does that not then make you think that the figures that you do present to us are just a tiny sliver of the portion? Because actually we're not looking at it on a sector-by-sector basis, and we don't really have an accurate picture of what the offshore situation is. And therefore it's not surprising that the figures you give us say, well, actually, it's all SMEs, because actually they're the low-hanging fruit here, and actually we don't have that good picture of what's going on offshore and what's going on in other sectors of the economy.
No, I don't agree. I mean, I'll pick up, I think there are two separate points in there. I mean, first of all, what we know about the online retail sector, I think we feel that we've got very good intelligence into that. It is a fast-moving market, so we need to keep that up to date. But we've taken successive steps since 2016 to address the compliance risks that we see there, and we'll continue to do so as necessary. And we've got we think a good handle on how much non-compliance there is and what kind of treatment plans are required for that. But taking the tax gap more generally, we have a comprehensive estimate of the tax gap. It is subject to the Code of Practice on Statistics and has been reviewed by the statistics regulator and found to be sound, but it is an estimate. When it comes to the offshore gap within it, whilst it is in there in the tax gap, being able to isolate it has proved challenging. We have made a first step towards that, as you know, in relation to data that we get from overseas authorities under automated exchange of information, but that is obviously a partial part of that tax gap and not the whole of it. So those are what I would call statistics in development, and we will need to continue working on them to get a better sort of picture of that part of the tax gap going forward.
So just to be clear, you stand by the estimates from HMRC that the lion's share of tax evasion is committed by small and medium-sized businesses.
Yes, that is the case. I mean, there are well over 5 million small businesses. That is a combination of people who are, full-time self-employed, but also people who have got a self-employment in addition to a main source, say, of employment income. So it's unsurprising that they represent a significant proportion of the tax gap because they're a significant proportion of the customer population. There are also particular features of self-employment that create risk. So, for example, they tend not to have tax deducted at source. There tends not to be a sort of third-party referential data that we can check. So there's sort of scope in small businesses to get their tax wrong, which doesn't apply in the case of an employee, for example. But and our estimate is that in recent years, as a proportion of the tax gap, that has grown.
Yeah, and you're not concerned, Sir Jim, that actually those in a position to conduct very aggressive tax planning or indeed tax evasion are the most difficult to identify. And in fact, small and medium-sized enterprises are the easiest to identify, and actually those who have tax experts, accountants, lawyers to help them are the ones who will be exploiting the offshore tax gap, which you yourself have admitted is uncertain. And the figure, I believe, that was presented to this committee last time was that it was only $1/3 billion, which I think many on this committee agreed was a shockingly small suggested figure. So I go back to my earlier point, which is I'm concerned that these figures and the data that's in this NAO report is sort of almost leaving out a big part of the picture by design. And actually, we know exactly what SMEs are doing because it's really easy to find out. And we don't know what online giants are doing and others in the online retail space and those who exploit offshore tax planning because it's really hard to find out. And the reason why it's hard to find out is because you guys don't have a good picture about what's going on and they are armed to the hilt with every accountant, tax expert and lawyer money could buy to make sure they get away with paying as little tax as possible.
No, I disagree. The tax gap measure includes large businesses and the wealthy. It includes legal interpretation, which is sort of challenging HMRC's interpretation of the law. It includes tax avoidance. In the case of wealthy taxpayers and large businesses, we have a very resource-intensive model of sort of man-marking them, really, because of the scale of the risk that they pose to the tax system. So they are probably an area where we've got almost greatest insight, case by case, into the attitudes and behaviours of the taxpayers. Penny's part of the organisation, I can assure you, does not find it easy to identify small business non-compliance. We can estimate it, but of course what the tax gap doesn't do is tell us case by case where that non-compliance is, which is why we have to devote so much resource to all aspects of the tax gap.
So just as a final point, if I may, Sir Jim, do you feel that online retail giants such as Amazon pay their fair share of tax?
Well, it's not for me to say what a fair share is. It's for me to say whether they are compliant with their obligations. We expect them to do two things. First of all, to comply and pay their own tax, but secondly, to play the correct part in the supply chain in helping us to manage the compliance risks, for example, of the people who sell on their platforms, which we have, new rules came in 2021, which place significant obligations on them to do so. There is no doubt that multinationals, including online giants, use international tax planning. There's been a long-standing OECD project to tackle that. That's about changing the tax rules as opposed to finding non-compliance by and large. And some progress has been made internationally.
Would you accept that not a huge amount of progress has been made, and actually that area of aggressive tax planning can often sort of spill over into tax evasion? That is the reality of this industry, is that tax avoidance, tax planning and tax evasion, it is a spectrum, and one can very quickly blur into the other. We know that Amazon didn't pay, its main UK division didn't pay any corporation tax last year or any corporation tax the year before. Now, I'm not saying that that's all evasion, but it does seem slightly concerning that we don't have an accurate picture about how they minimise their tax liabilities, where they put their income generated in the UK so that they can pay less corporation tax and other taxes. And yet we seem to have such a clear picture about what SMEs are doing, which goes back to this concern that actually HMRC only really know a very small part of the picture. And which is why I asked the question, do you think Amazon pay their fair share of tax when they haven't paid any corporation tax in the UK on their main division for the last 2 years?
When it comes to non-compliance, we do have a picture, and it is included in our measure of the tax gap of non-compliance by large businesses, and that includes the online giants. There is no doubt that multinationals, including tech giants, engage in international tax planning and leverage their ability to sort of shift profits.
Leverage small and medium-sized businesses simply do not have.
I think we've got...
That's generally correct. It's a different type of compliance behaviour. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Lieutenant. I mean, we were getting quite close to we were in tax policy there, which is probably not a matter for this committee, but nevertheless, I think Mr. Hatton makes a really good point. And I think we need to be looking at taxing where the activity actually takes place, not from where it might be taking place around the world. So I think that is probably something to think about, Mr. Jim. I gather that Louise she's outside. So in courtesy to her, I'm going to call a 5-minute break. It's sort of about 16 minutes past 4. If we could be back here just a smidgen, or ready to start a smidgen after 4:20, that would be really helpful. So order. Order. Louise Smyth, a particularly warm welcome to you. I'm sorry you've had such a difficult journey, but we do appreciate your persistence and actually making it here today, so warm welcome. And I think we are now going on to Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, Jim, we're coming back to online marketplaces and referring to what we were talking about earlier, that online marketplaces are now responsible for collecting VAT information from overseas sellers. And when this was introduced, HMRC actually collected 5 times more tax than they expected, which is obviously good news. But I'm interested to know how you managed to underestimate to such a large degree the tax losses that you were previously making. So could you comment a bit on that?
Yes, so the 2021 measures do 2 things. First of all, they do change policy so that more tax is due than was previously the case, but they also address non-compliance by making online marketplaces responsible for accounting for VAT from overseas sellers that are not established in the UK. And as you say, those measures are raising significantly more tax than we envisaged. I think there are a number of factors. First of all, online selling took off quite significantly because of for example, because of the pandemic, and it has been rapidly growing. But in addition, we did have imperfect information prior to that. It is, I think, positive that the yield is between 1.4 billion and 1.8 billion a year, starting in 21-22 and going up to 2026-27. It's not perfect. Like all parts of the tax system, there is still leakage from that, which we will want to continue to bear down on. And in addition, whilst it was 2021 that the rules were introduced, they are still relatively new for the online marketplaces, and we continue to work with them, and I think that we will be able to get more from them over time as they settle in and as the marketplaces become better at operating them.
At least 3 things I heard you say that might have contributed to that underestimate. There's a change in policy, you've cracked down on non-compliance, and there's an increase in volume. Have you broken down between those 3 things and indeed any potential other factors? Which ones you think might have been most contributory to your
I don't have any further breakdown. I mean, I can certainly look, and if I've got more information, I can let you know.
Thank you. And Ms. Ciniewicz, obviously been a big underestimate in the losses, the previous losses, even if we're not quite sure why. What assurances can you give us that there aren't other areas where we may have underestimated losses? For example, setting up a Phoenix companies, for example. Are we sure about how much tax loss we're currently experiencing?
So I think all of the tax estimates that we propose, I mean, the tax gap itself is, it's a publication that, as Jim said at the start, is assured by the Office of Statistics Regulation, and that, but it has uncertainties in it, and those uncertainties are set out in the tax gap. We don't have perfect information, but we do have a lot of information in HMRC, and we do have a lot of data. The Phoenixism estimate was the first estimate was published in our annual report and accounts this year, and it was a first estimate. And we continue constantly to try to refine our data to get a better understanding of what is going on.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just ask you, please, Penny Ciniewicz, if I could take you to paragraph 2.15 on page 35 of the report. And it's got there 3 bullet points of why why the NAO think there might be reasons why VAT collection has been sidestepped. Increasingly sophisticated false documentation, purchasing of UK citizens' private individual accounts to not appear as retail businesses, and the use of shell companies registered in the UK. Is that something that you've researched, and do you place weight on any of that? And if so, what are you doing about it?
So I think we actively police the issue here is particularly UK establishment, and we do actively work in the area of UK establishments. It is for the online marketplaces to do the majority of that work. But for instance, over the last year, we have written to nearly 13,000 businesses in, to test the kind of understanding of UK establishment. And what we found with those were that 11,000 of those, 11,700 of those we wanted were non-established. So we have adjusted their VAT treatment. But when we actually checked back with the online marketplaces, they had already been treating the vast majority of those, 11,000 of those, as non-established. And they're adjusting more of those as we speak. So we are actively supporting the online marketplaces to police that activity, and indeed we have been working to bring out new guidance to support them, which will be available in the new year. Sorry, dry throat.
And don't worry,
Yeah.
take as long as you want.
But I think we constantly it's an important part of the online marketplace compliance process. So we are keen to support the online marketplaces with that.
Just over the page on paragraph 2.17, it says HMRC does not know how many other businesses may be falsely appearing as UK established but have not identified in its risk assessment.
I suppose there's an unknown in everything.
Of course.
But we have I think we feel that there is we have a relatively high degree of confidence in the work that the online marketplaces are doing, and it is their responsibility in this system to do the work to test that scale of establishment. And that example that I've just given you, I think demonstrates that actually they have a fairly good grip at the moment. We're not relaxed about it, but we are seeing, I think, some really good results as evidenced by the amount that we predict is going to be brought in by this change.
So I'm delighted that this committee and the NAO pushed you into getting for a change of law to establish this tax on marketplaces, which is now bringing in an extra £1.5 billion. Thank you very much. Luke Charters.
Thank you, Chair. It's to yourself, Louise Smyth, in regards fraudulent companies. But the reality today is that for a fraudster or a criminal, it's far too easy to register as a company at Companies House, isn't it?
Well, I think the introduction of the Act that came into force in March has made it much harder. Previously, we didn't have powers to query or challenge any information that was given us. In fact, if it was properly delivered, which actually means just that people filled in the form and put information that looked right in the right boxes, then we were duty bound to accept it. With the new Act, we now have the ability and authority to query information that comes into us, to annotate the register if we're concerned about information, and to remove information if we think it's suspicious. So they're really good strides in taking action against fraudulent companies, but actually there's more to come. And I think the introduction of identity verification is a huge step forward in terms of verifying that people are who they say they are and that we know who we're dealing with.
Thank you. I'll come on to the IDV verification in a moment, if I may, but do you share my concern that actually fraudsters and criminals could have stockpiled listed companies before the Act powers was fully implemented? And what are you doing in relation to this risk?
Yeah, they could have done, and in the report, the surge in applications was attributed to that. I actually think the surge was more about people avoiding the fee increase, but I can talk about that if anybody asks questions. But just because they've registered prior to the Act doesn't mean that we can't take retrospective action against them. For example, when we introduce IDV, we will be applying that to all officers who are on the existing register as well as new ones. So they'll be caught up in that. But also, if we're suspicious about any element of the company, then we can take retrospective action. It doesn't matter that they incorporated before the Act came into force.
And can I come on to the ID verification? Because having worked as head of financial crime in the private sector, ID verification does make a significant impact in reducing fraud, but I was concerned that some of the timelines following on from the initial public target of March 2025, they do seem slow, if I may, because if they were introduced sooner, we'd ultimately see fewer fraudulent companies in Companies House defrauding the taxpayer, defrauding my constituent. So have you looked at the business case for accelerating that programme of work, because it could have a material impact on reducing the overall level of fraud and economic crime in the system?
Yeah, I mean, everyone would like to go quicker, including me, but this is a large and complex digital programme. We are taking the government's one login and using that for the ID verification, but it's not just a plug-and-play solution. It will require integration with all our digital systems. And actually, previously our digital systems have been developed on the premise that we're dealing with a company rather than an individual, and that's where that relationship is. So it has required us to do a significant amount of work to make sure that we integrate it properly. This is also a big change, a big change for Companies House, so we need to make sure that we've recruited the right resources to support people through that process and to manage it, that we've trained them, that we have the proper processes in place. But also it's a big change for the business community that are going to have to interact with us. And so we need to make sure that we prepare them properly for that change. IDV will be available in the spring of 2025, so not that long to wait now. And that will be on a voluntary basis, and so we're introducing a 6-month period where people can voluntarily go through the IDV process so that they're kind of well prepared in advance for when we mandate it. We're hoping to push as many people through during that 6-month period as we can to minimise the impact on people if they have difficulties when it becomes mandatory. But from autumn 2025, we will be mandating IDV. We'll be tying it to submission of people's confirmation statements, which is a time when they have to interact with us on an annual basis. And we're aiming to get we anticipate 7.5 million officers who are currently on the register through the IDV process within a year. And why we're staggering it over the year is because obviously those volumes are quite big and we need to support people going through that, but also we're, as I said, tying it with a time when they would interact with us anyway.
Just on that, are you tying it to the annual confirmation statement, if that's right?
Yeah.
Would it not be better to adopt a risk-based approach, looking at the machine learning and other risk-based factors that you're looking at, to identify which companies, which incorporations are most likely to be in regards to fraud and economic crime, and to actually target it based on the data set that you've got, rather than simply waiting for the confirmation statement to come up? Wouldn't it be better to bring forward those that have a higher risk factor?
That is an alternative way of doing it, but given the volume of people that we've got to get through, we've decided to tie it to that and to do it in a kind of orderly and straightforward manner for people. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other things we can do with our new powers to based on our risk profiling to take action against companies that we think are conducting fraudulent activity.
May I move on to my next set of questions around, which is primarily directed to yourself, Sir Jim, around overseas companies. Again, it's very easy for an overseas company to present in the UK because the proof of address, it just isn't there. Surely this has got to be a priority, and as every month that this delay in the implementation goes on, there's more of a tax gap that we're missing out on.
So certainly, I mean, we welcome the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, and we're working closely with Companies House to support its implementation. It will help us with tax compliance. we do automatically create a corporation tax record for any registered company, but we do not automatically create the VAT registration because there are particular risks that we want to manage through the VAT registration process, which company registration simply doesn't enable us to do. So we have our own VAT registration service. We collect our own data. We do adopt a risk-based approach to checks on that. They all go through, 100% of applications go through a risk assessment, and about less than 50% of them automatically process. Just over 50% of them trigger one of our risk rules, and therefore we will carry out further validation checks or compliance checks on those, and that includes in some circumstances the address, but not routinely in all cases. As Penny mentioned, we did carry out an exercise earlier this year where we identified a large number of overseas companies that had registered for VAT on the basis that they were established in the UK, where our evidence suggested that that was not the case, and we ultimately changed the registration for a significant number of them and have recorded them as non-established in the UK for VAT purposes. They still need to be registered with us, but reassuringly, when we checked what the online marketplaces were doing, in the vast majority of those cases, they had identified them as not established and were applying the correct VAT treatment. In addition, we spoke at the beginning of the hearing about the 11,000 businesses that varied their registration to an address in Cardiff, who were overseas businesses. We also checked them, and whilst some of them had VAT debts to HMRC predating the online marketplace rules coming in, none have after that. And when we checked with the online marketplaces, we found that about 70% of those 11,000 businesses were selling on online marketplaces, and about 95% of their sales the marketplaces had accounted for VAT. So I think we've got some confidence that the VAT register, combined with the line of defence that the online marketplaces due diligence rules give us, are working pretty well. But it is definitely a borderline in the regime which poses a compliance risk and which we've got to monitor all the time. And as the NAO report highlights, there are some very sophisticated and persistent attempts to game it.
Well, forgive me, Sir Jim, it does seem to me as if there's joint responsibility between HMRC and Companies House for determining whether a company is operating overseas. So where does that sit? And can you give some clarity about who's ultimately accountable for that?
So in the case of VAT, some overseas businesses are required to register in the UK for VAT, so it is right that they do so, but it is important that they correctly record whether they are established in the UK. In other words, they've got a presence here, or in fact they are trading entirely from overseas into the UK. We saw in that exercise earlier this year that a significant number of businesses were not doing that correctly, and in fact when we engaged with them, they mostly argued with us that they were doing it correctly, which suggests that there's quite an education required. But we also are working with Companies House on registration, including, quite apart from implementing the Act, but also on the recommendation from the National Audit Office for a more joint registration service. That all has to fit in with Companies House's quite extensive programme of work. But as I say, in the meantime, we have our own registration process for VAT, which does not rely on the Companies House register.
And finally, perhaps for Ms Ciniewicz, given that your approach is focused on preventing tax evasion before it occurs, are you doing enough to ensure that businesses really are operating in the UK, and are you investing enough in that area of compliance?
We certainly want to invest more, and particularly in our systems and our data, and identity verification and authentication, and further development of that in HMRC is important as well. But we are, I think we're pleased with the the new VAT registration process and systems that we've put in place. That has, we think, prevented revenue loss of nearly 500 million just at the stage of that first initial risking, and then probably another 170 million from the further compliance checks. I'm continually looking to do more to prevent. So I would say that we're very focused on this and extremely focused on our partnership working with Companies House, and we're collaborating with them on a whole range of work to help implement the Act.
Can I just follow that question? I mean, this is an incredibly difficult area, I would imagine, to try and establish exactly the status of an overseas company in some very different regimes to ours, not used to the same tax type of regimes as ours. Could you not employ, when I say employ, I mean that in the loosest sense of the word, not literally, but people like customs agents and the online marketplaces themselves to check the statuses of these companies?
So the online marketplace rules do in fact put the onus on the online marketplace to ascertain the place of establishment for VAT, and they do have a lot of data information that will help them to do that, which is why we think it's helpful that legislation gives them that responsibility. And then we're also looking, at the other end of that process at, doing as much as we can to educate people. We are probably one of the first tax administrations to translate all our guidance about it, our VAT processes into Mandarin, and that has been very successfully launched in China. And other tax administrations, I think, are indeed looking at that and thinking that's a very good thing to do. So we try to cover the whole range of customer behaviour. We try to make sure that people who want to get their tax right get the information, and at the other end that we're preventing bad actors entering the system.
Just a question for both Sir Jim and Louise Smyth, please. If I could take you to paragraph 17 on page 10, and the key phrase there is HMRC and Customs House have discussed closer integrations of systems to tighten registration requirements to estimate these would take 5 to 10 years. In a very fast-moving world, with you both having fairly sophisticated digital system, that seems an awful long time. I wonder what we can do to speed. If we can't get two key government departments communicating with each other successfully electronically in a short space of time, there must be something wrong, isn't there? And the criminals out there will know that perfectly well, won't they?
Louise can come in a moment, but we are very actively engaged on that, and my deputy Angela MacDonald has regular meetings with Louise on that programme. I think there are a number of reasons why it is a big project which requires investment. So first of all, in sort of legal or policy terms, we do actually have different definitions in our two regimes which need to be tied together to have an integrated service. But also, as Louise said, there is a whole range of change under the Act that has just come in that has to be implemented in the right sequence. But certainly when we are preparing our spending review submission, we're getting that ready for the next 3 years beyond 25-26. We've already got some investment next year to help us to reform our registration processes, and we want to bid for more to precisely overhaul the registration process and do that in conjunction with Companies House.
Louise Smyth?
Yeah, I would agree. It's actually quite a significant prize if we were able to deliver this. From Companies House perspective, for the next 2 to 3 years, our shopping list is full in terms of delivering what the Act requires of us. And although we would like to do this, I think we need to deliver what has already been given us to deliver by the new Act before we start on something as significant as this. And it will require significant resource, significant change for the business world as well, because one of the issues is that we have different dates that people have to file with us, and that would cause disruption to the timeline of businesses in how they interact with government, and we would have to manage that carefully as we delivered, as well as the significant digital changes that would be required.
Presumably both of you were consulted on the new Act. it's slightly disappointing if that's the case, that you're still saying there's difficulties in legal definitions between the two of you, which is one of the impediments to making this closer digital cooperation.
So I think we're looking at something here that is over and above what is in the Act. So the Act contains a number of steps, primarily for Companies House to carry out, although we're working with them. What we're looking at here is a recommendation to go further than that. And as Louise says, there is a significant prize from that, but it's also a major change. HMRC certainly are keen to make as rapid progress on it as we can. And as I say, we've got a joint work at Chief Executive and Deputy Chief Executive level to try and make that happen. It will be subject to investment, but we are actively working on the case for that investment. Well,
we'll leave that there for the moment, but I'm sure we'll want to return to that. Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Jim, there's a striking piece of evidence at Figure 10 in the report about how online marketplaces are being used actively, marketed as a way of evading the tax rules. And I wonder if you could comment perhaps about what HMRC are doing about cracking down on this marketing of evasion tactics to overseas sellers.
Yes, so I mean, what Figure 10 shows is, a very, quite a sophisticated and persistent attempt to create a false sort of documentation trail to enable an overseas business to masquerade as established in the UK, when in fact it is not. We do think that is very much a minority activity. The vast majority of cases, as we've demonstrated from the two exercises that we've conducted, the online marketplaces are correctly identifying non-established businesses and accounting for VAT correctly. However, it is something that we will carry on monitoring, because we know it is a borderline in that regime that people will try to cross to the other side of it in order to escape the online marketplaces deduction of sort of VAT from them, and this is the really most sophisticated end of it being marketed to people. So it's something that we're alive to, but both of the significant exercises that we've done so far suggest that the rules, whilst they are not watertight, are working really well, hence the level of yield that we're seeing from them.
You're currently estimating that about half of the 300 million which you identify as deliberate evasion from selling goods and services online, about half of that comes through the online marketplaces. What makes you so sure about that?
I don't think that's quite right. I mean, arithmetically, it is. So I think what the estimate is that there's about £700 million worth of leakage here, 300 million of which is deliberate evasion, and 150 million of the 700 is the online marketplaces not applying the rules fully. So Penny mentioned those cases where we had identified that these companies were wrongly recorded as established. I think there were, when we went, there were about 12,700 of them. When we went to the online marketplaces, we found that they were correctly accounting for VAT in about 11,000 of them, but not in relation to about 1,700, and that's, for example, where that 150 million figure comes from. We need to keep working with the online marketplaces to shrink that, as well as to stay on top of new risks as they emerge.
Thank you. Ms. Ciniewicz, how are you working with the online marketplaces to make sure that they're applying the correct back treatment?
We do work closely with those marketplaces, and we do, as you can see, we also conduct our own compliance activity on a risk-based basis in order to supplement their insight and their understanding. And we do share understanding of risks and insight, and indeed where we have evidence that customers are not correctly registered, then we share that with them. And we're also working with them to develop new guidance, which will be available from the new year, which will help them to understand some of the kinds of tests that they could be applying. It isn't a simple playbook, because you have to take into account the situation of the individual firm, but it will help to give them more to go on as well.
Do you think the online marketplaces have access to enough HMRC data to be able to do the job they need to do most effectively?
I have no sense that more data is required for them to do that job, and as Jim has indicated, what we're seeing is quite a a strong performance in terms of their ability to identify those companies, but we're always keen to support them.
Thank you. Ms Smyth, the introduction of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, how much has fraudulent company registration reduced since the introduction of that Act?
Very difficult to say. We estimated prior to the Act coming in that there was 5% fraud and error, fraud on the register. External commentators have put that more at 20%. I suspect the figure is somewhere in between those two. Difficult to say how much it's reduced. I do know what action we've taken. So we have removed 50,000 registered office address from the register. What we do is default them to our address and then we send them on to the strike-off route. And we are referring companies for strike-off at a rate of 3,000 a week at the moment. We've also removed numerous other kind of bits of information which we've identified as fraudulent. And this affects 63,700 companies. So there's plenty there. I think at this stage it's difficult to say how much we're reducing it. And I think it's always going to be difficult because you don't know what's there that you haven't spotted yet. And also, one of the things that is a problem is that actually the serious kind of organised criminals are probably going to be compliant on the register because they would want to look as if they're doing all that they should, and they're going to be quite difficult to spot. So we need to make sure that we increase our intelligence capability so that we know those risk indicators to look for, and we are working on that.
So I imagine, Ms Smyth, if you're finding it hard to estimate how much fraudulent activity has been, or fraudulent registration has been avoided or detected, then it's going to be quite difficult to say how much tax evasion has also been prevented as a result. Is that right?
Well, we know how much we've stopped, but we don't know how much was there in the first place or whether it's actually increasing in certain areas. So we can estimate how much we stopped, but how that translates into tax, I'm not sure.
I mean, our estimate of the tax gap doesn't tie back to, for example, registration in Companies House. As I said, in the particular risk, the register that we really manage closely, which is the VAT register, because it is our first line of defence from fraudsters. We don't rely on Companies House registrations. We have our own registration process for that. And in 2022, we introduced a new VAT registration online system and overhauled the risk assessment and sort of controls in that in order to reduce the risks to us, and we keep that under review. I mean, as I said, we would like to embark on a more wholesale overhaul of our registration processes with investment.
So currently, is it true to say that although we know that fraudulent company registration is a risk for tax evasion, it's actually impossible to estimate or...
I mean, as Penny mentioned, we know that since the new VAT registration service went live in August 2022, that we've blocked just under £500 million worth of tax loss through that, plus a further 170 million in 23-24 from the additional checks that we carry out on registration. It is a first line of defence. Registration in itself is not the loss of tax, but it is people getting onto the register who shouldn't be there or getting on with the wrong classification that then creates a tax risk, and we would prefer to prevent that upstream at the registration stage where possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Olney. Clive Betts.
We're talking about joint working. Most of the public looking at this would say, well, they're all part of government, aren't they? Why are we going to have to legislate to get them to work together? Shouldn't they be doing that anyway?
Well, we were doing it anyway, and
we certainly have worked together for many years closely. However, mean, as Louise said, until the Act came into force, Companies House had very restricted powers to police the company register, which is one of the reasons why we have our own processes over and above that. The Act really creates an opportunity for us to enhance the both working together, but also efficiency in terms of only doing things once if we possibly can. But it came into force in March, and it is a very large project for Companies House. We are supporting Companies House wherever we can because it's important to us that it be implemented. So, for example, Louise mentioned the sort of cleansing of the existing register, and we've been sharing data for where in areas where we think the register may be wrong to help Companies House to do that.
So when will you have completed all the tasks that you're required to do by the Act?
The implementation will take place over the next 2 years. So, you know, we've got significant things to deliver. I mean, IDV is the big one for next year, but there are other things that will come along. For example, mandation of accounts, digital mandation of accounts will be a big thing for us to deliver, but that will give us significant benefits in terms of our ability to then tag the data that's provided to us, which will enable people and machines to be able to interrogate that data and will be of use to HMRC as well as to us.
That'll all be done within 2 years?
2 to 3 years, yeah.
Oh, 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years from when?
Well, we're dependent on our resources, our programme of work, but also on secondary legislation and when that comes through. So there's a significant programme of secondary legislation attached to the Act. And for some things, you know, the digital mandation of accounts will be, again, a significant gain for us, but we need to make sure that we do it right and that we've prepared the business community properly for it.
Again, kind of have a target date as to when you're aiming to have all the measures in place that you're required to do by the Act?
Our programme is planned out for 3 years.
3 years from when?
From March.
Last March?
From March this year.
Ah, yeah. March. So it's effectively 4 years from the Act coming in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. And in terms of address verification, will that be part of that process? Because again, I think most people, again, the lay people looking on would think, if someone's going to register a business, 2 things ought to be pretty clearly required to do. One is to prove who they are, and secondly is to prove where their business is located. Yeah.
Address verification isn't part of the Act. There's always a balance between economic growth, creating an environment where companies can, you know, and the focus has very much been in the past on the speed of registering a company and the ease of setting up a company. And the Act sought to redress that balance by putting a focus on economic crime, which is a growing problem. But the decision was made that identity verification was the big prize here, and address verification, which would be an additional burden for business, wasn't included in the Act. And you know, if once we've done the identity verification, it's considered that address verification would be required as well, then obviously that will need to be legislated for. So
it's still going to be possible for Mr. or Mrs. Bloggs to register their address at 10 High Street without you checking whether 10 High Street really exists?
Yes, because I have no legal powers to do that. But there is work that we do in the background around preventing addresses getting on the register in the first place when we can see that they're fraudulently being used. And we've had some good gains in that space, but also getting them off quickly when they've been used fraudulently.
Right, why don't you just ask for the information? Are you not allowed to ask for the information?
That's not covered in the Act.
Right, is that something you're pressing to be changed, is it?
It's something that we do discuss with the department, yeah.
Is that something you'd like to change?
What does that actually mean? It's something you discuss with the
department?
department?
Well, obviously it's for the department and ministers to decide on what is included in legislation. But obviously, I mean, as you say, the more checks that are done, the more, you know, if we checked ID as well as addresses, then we have more certainty around the information that we've got. Currently, we don't have legislation to do the addresses.
Being able to check addresses then would enable you to better tackle evasion and fraud.
Yeah.
Coming on to Sir Jim, if I might, there's certain things that you aren't doing that other countries have done, and transaction-based reporting. Why, if it would help you again tackle evasion?
I think that is something that we keep under review. We've got Making Tax Digital, which now requires all businesses, for example, all VAT registered businesses currently required, and from 2026 all income tax registered businesses to keep digital records. That is something that you could look at in the future to build out from that. In addition, the government has said that it will consult in the spring on e-invoicing and increasing the use of that, and that is also a sort of method of standardising the data. But I do think different countries start from different positions. So if you take VAT, one way of managing compliance risks around VAT would be to get lots and lots of transaction level data, and as a tax administrator I might absolutely love that, but it would be quite burdensome, and when you look at the VAT gap, it has been actually decreasing over time, so we would have to justify any change of that nature by reference to it being good value for money and a proper burden to place on businesses. So I think it's something we constantly look at, and we constantly check with our international partners how they're using it and how effective it is, but it's not something the UK at this point has introduced.
You haven't introduced it, you're not planning to introduce it, but have you done an assessment about whether there would be benefits from introducing it?
We've certainly looked with international partners at what benefits they get and what benefits we might be able to get, but we also have to, as we do that, we have to bear in mind the different circumstances in the UK. For example, our VAT gap is significantly different from that in some other countries that have introduced that. But I can't predict what would happen in the future, but you could see how it is something that could be built on the foundations that we've created in the future if it was decided to do so.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to an answer about whether you think there might actually be a benefit at wearing up the costs on the other side from actually bringing transaction-based reporting in, bearing in mind the different circumstances in the UK. Have you done an assessment yet as to whether there would be net benefits? I don't believe we certainly have not published any formal assessment. Penny's area gathers lots and lots of data. We've discussed the data we are going to get from online marketplaces from next month. Generally speaking, the more data we can get, the better we can manage tax compliance. How big a difference it would make, given that our VAT gap is already relatively low and reducing, is not clear. No, it isn't clear because you haven't done an assessment, have you? Which would be helpful if you did the assessment. You might be a bit clearer about whether there would be benefits.
Well, we've taken other steps. For example, Making Tax Digital for VAT, which has made significant inroads into error in the VAT system. We regarded that as a greater priority to do.
I'm not saying that other things aren't important. I'm merely suggesting that at some point it might be worthwhile doing an assessment. Is that something you would intend to do in the future?
It's certainly something, I can't say that we will, but it's certainly it is a method of managing compliance risk that we're well aware of and we keep under review.
Thank you, hi Bets. Can I just come back to you, Louise Smyth? I mean, this committee is under no illusions of the scale of how you've got to transform Companies House. It is a massive, one of the biggest changes in your history. We are under no illusion on that. And you gave an answer to Mr. Betts that you thought it could be done in 2 or 3 years, which, if you can achieve it in that time scale, I think is admirable. But just to give you sort of one of the sort of scales of the difficulties that you're under. I mean, I have nothing against the Chinese in general, I preface that by asking, before I ask this question, but we have received evidence from a Graham Barrow, a fraud specialist who works on behalf of banks and other financial institutions, who has said that since the start of the year, about 30,000 companies that appeared to have Chinese directors had registered at Companies House. I mean, that in itself is a massive task. If that's true, that just one item is a massive task, is it not, to check the veracity of those companies?
Yes, I mean, obviously, we can't assume that just because they have Chinese directors they're fraudulent. But we have recognised and is published in our strategic intelligence assessment that overseas companies are a particular risk for us. And, we are developing a control strategy underneath that, which will provide the tactical plans in how we deal with that. We've increased our capacity in the intelligence space. These are probably very small compared with HMRC numbers, but from less than 10 a couple of years ago to 130 now, and we're making really good progress in setting up the infrastructure for us to be able to do this strategic intelligence work and to address key issues that are threats to the register. And since March we've shared 420 different intelligence assessments with law enforcement, with other government departments like HMRC and Insolvency Service, which can enable other people. So we're pulling on the resources and the expertise that are out there to enable other people to use those intelligence sources to investigate from their perspective or to take action against criminality.
Are the pair of you and the HMRC, Companies House and HMRC, able to fully share intelligence at the moment? Is there any impediment for you to doing that?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, whilst HMRC has to keep its data confidential, actually we've got about 250 legal gateways for sharing for a whole variety of purposes, including with Companies House, and we have, for example, recently shared data with Companies House to help them with their cleansing of the register.
Really helpful. Thank you, both of you. Luke Charteris.
It's back to my earlier point, really, just to build on that. It seems like you're rolling out ID verification based on operational convenience to Companies House rather than economic crime risk to the United Kingdom as a whole. I mean, I don't know if you want to answer that, but that's just my takeaway, really, from your response.
Yeah, I suppose my response would be the same, that there are other ways that we can tackle that. And, our strategic intelligence assessment has identified those risk areas, and we're doing work proactively to tackle those. But IDV is a massive operational challenge, but also a challenge for the companies that are going to have to comply with it, and we need to make it as simple as possible for them. And within a year, they will all be IDV'd. And you have to remember, there hasn't been anything before. So within a year, we'll be in a totally different position in relation to IDV.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louise Smyth. Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to disclose before I start that I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland and the Chartered Institute of Taxation. To Sir Jim Harra, so why do you not know how much tax evasion HMRC is stopping?
Well, we do record
numerically the amount.
Right, we do record how much additional revenues we collect. So last year it was about £41.8 billion, and within that we have information about the type of non-compliance, so the tax base, the type of customer, but also the sort of culpability of the behaviour. So, for example, over the last 5 years we've charged penalties in about 90,000 cases where we consider that it was evasion, it was deliberate non-compliance, so we do gather that information.
You do have the number broken down for tax evasion then?
Well, we have
a number for tax evasion that HMRC have stopped with its various initiatives.
We certainly have data about the deliberate non-compliance that we have addressed either through criminal or investigations and prosecutions or through civil penalties for deliberate. So that's our definition of evasion, in effect, deliberate non-compliance.
Would it be possible for us to have some more information after this of those numbers? Because I think that's not coming through in the report that we've got. So.
Yeah, we can certainly look at what we can give you.
Thank you. And I guess just following up from that, sort of what assurance can you give us that you're getting value for money with the various initiatives that you're doing in order to, in tackling tax evasion?
Overall, we have a rate of return of about £22 for every pound we spend in customer compliance group, and I think I'm not sure if I'm quoting exactly, but recently the NAO have given a report that says that it is without doubt value for money. Obviously, within that, we have got we're covering different types of behaviour, and so there are, that's an average over the whole of the compliance group, but it is a very positive rate of return. And if you look at the investment that the government announced on the 30th of October, that also gives a very healthy rate of return over 5 years.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca Paul. Now we move, please, to Sarah Green.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to return us back to the issue of phoenixism, if I may. And my first question is to you, Sir Jim, and it's to ask, how concerned are you that phoenixism has increased since the pandemic, and what are you doing to address it? We've long recognised it as a risk within the system across a number of different taxes. We have for the first time come up with our estimate of it in 22-23. We believe that about 15% of all the losses to non-payment came from phoenixism, so it was somewhere between 500 and 600 million pounds. That's not within our statistics because it's an operational estimate, but we will continue to refine that as well as updating it for later years. So it is, that's a significant amount of money that we want to tackle, as well as it being a very egregious type of behaviour. You mentioned 2022-2023, but you've not reported on the overall performance and impact of your work on phoenixism in 2023-24 yet. Why is that?
So that is the net loss after all of our activities. So that's what we have not managed to stop. But we do have a very extensive insolvency practice within HMRC, and we have a number of actions that we take against phoenixism, including through some recent legislative powers that we've been given. One issue for us in relation to phoenixism, in contrast with a commercial creditor, is that we have to deal with everyone who has a tax liability, so we can't choose not to deal with someone because they pose a risk of debt to us or a risk of sort of abuse of insolvency. But we have taken some powers. So, for example, we now have powers to insist on a financial security from people who we believe pose a risk of phoenixism to us. And in 23-24, we estimate that protected about £125 million that we would otherwise have lost. So basically, you have to give us that financial security, and then in the event that you go insolvent, we can use that against any debts in the insolvency. If you fail to adhere to a security requirement, that is a criminal offence. And last year we had 110 prosecutions for that and 78 convictions. So that's one example. In addition, since 2020, we've had a power to issue notices to directors to make them personally liable for the debts of their company in the event that they are abusing the insolvency service. And again, last year we issued 53 of those notices for £15 million. And although it came into effect in 2020, it doesn't apply retrospectively it only applies to liabilities arising after that. So we expect that to ramp up quite considerably in the current year and future years. And in addition, we will make referrals to the insolvency service if we see grounds for why someone needs to be disqualified, for example, as a director for abusing the insolvency rules. So that is, that is the range of activity that we're undertaking to tackle.
Thank you. I'm going to direct my next question to you, if I may, Dean Beale. Thank you again for coming this afternoon. Why is it so difficult to disqualify company directors for phoenixism?
Well, it isn't difficult to disqualify directors where there is evidence of unfitness. and phoenixism can very much be an aggravating factor in determining the seriousness of misconduct that may have gone on in a company. So there's no sort of statutory offence of phoenixism, but we disqualified last year 1,222 directors, which was about 30% up on the previous year. We expect to do around the same again this year. The majority of those disqualifications were for quite serious misconduct around bounce-back loans and other COVID support measures. But within that population of disqualified directors, there will have been many cases where there's been taxes unpaid. That may have been repeat behaviour as well, which is really where we're coming from a Phoenix point of view. It's about, somebody somebody trading, not paying their taxes, the business goes insolvent, they set up again, doing something broadly similar, trade again, don't pay their taxes. And certainly pre-COVID, the majority of our director disqualification actions were cases where the lead allegation was that there'd been some particular sort of intent to trade to the detriment of the Crown, some abuse of the tax system, not paying over taxes, using the money that you recover from customers through VAT or for PAYE deducted from employees, not sort of handing that over to the to HMRC, but using those for other purposes. But since COVID, we have a sort of more serious matter of misconduct that has become more apparent in the cases that we review. And of course, we will lead on the more serious allegation. So, whilst the NAO report picked up, a very small number of pure Phoenix cases that we've done over the years, that doesn't really sort of give a good indication of the amount of work we do where there is misconduct in relation to tax affairs, or generally, where we're disqualifying directors for more serious allegations, and that's borne out by the sort of periods of disqualification that we see now. So pre-pandemic, when the majority of our disqualifications were in relation to tax affairs, we saw the average disqualification period of being around sort of 5.5 years. Now it's closer to 10 years because BBL abuse is generally seen as being more serious, of quasi-criminal by courts, and that attracts a higher tariff. So, we're taking these directors out of the marketplace, and every director we take out of the marketplace is another sort of prevention of future phoenixism because they're banned, and to breach that is a criminal offence, and actually would also bring in more opportunities for personal liability where they do breach a disqualification order.
Do you have a sense of how much of your caseload involves phoenixism?
It's not something that unfortunately our somewhat aged systems that we're hoping to replace in the next couple of years, I know that's been a common theme through this, is we're able to sort of readily extract that without going through and reviewing every single case that we do. I would say that it's probably around sort of 10% or maybe lower, where we're genuinely seeing that repeated behaviour as an aggravating factor. But certainly with something like a very clear misconduct around bounce-back loans, we will investigate as much as we can, within reason. And if we've got a good case based on a bounce-back loan, the extent of our investigation, we won't sort of expend more time and resource if it's not going to get us a better outcome than if we just lead with, a more serious allegation like that. But it's something that's on the back of the NAO report, and we've started an action group across our three organisations to specifically look at phoenixism. It's something that we're really keen to bring more to the fore, be more overt about those cases where actually there is this repeat pattern of behaviour, and we want to make sure that we're going to be doing more going forwards to sort of demonstrate that but not at the expense of us pursuing more serious offences.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah Green. On this subject, paragraph 3.21 on page 48, and the number of directors disqualified would concur with what you're just saying. But in the last 5 years, between 2018 and 2023-4, you have successfully managed to disqualify 6,274 directors, but only 7 of those were directly for phoenixism.
Yeah.
Does sound as, and you say at the end of that, or the NAO say at the end of that paragraph, the Insolvency Service is told us it's reviewing how it measures its performance in tackling phoenixism. It does sound as though your service could do a bit more in this respect.
As I say, I think it's more around communicating the nature of the cases that we're taking action on, rather than we need to take different action, specifically to tackle phoenixism. As I say, if we can take a director out of the marketplace for 10 years because they've abused bounce-back loans, they may have also not paid their taxes in the current company that we're looking at, and indeed in the previous company, if they've got a history of that. But that in terms of achieving our objective, which is to take a bad actor out of the marketplace, it won't sort of benefit us. But I think, if I could be sort of self-critical, we're kind of missing maybe some important information there about the fact that phoenixism is not good. We expect people to run their businesses responsibly and lawfully and pay their taxes. And I think there's more that we've agreed to do to try and get that message more sort of overtly out there.
It could be that if you get one or two high-profile cases and publicise them well, the deterrent effect could be quite significant.
Yeah, we've got some plans around that already, and it's something that we're committing to do more on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lloyd Hatton, please.
Thank you, Chair. If I may push a little bit further on that point that the Chair just made. I mean, that track record, it's not great. I mean, only 7 of those were specifically for phoenixism. As we've discussed, though, this is at least £500 million of lost tax, which is obviously a significant figure. However, we also know that perhaps even more pressingly, this is a vehicle for other forms of economic crime, primarily money laundering. So I don't think anyone in this room would doubt that this is a significant issue, and one that is a sort of multifaceted one. So with that in mind, can you give us any measure of how your performance on tackling rogue company directors is going to improve? And do you honestly think that figure of only 7 is acceptable?
We need to understand what that 7 is. That's 7 cases where there was nothing more serious to pursue other than, and in fact one of those cases which I had a look at in anticipation of this committee session has nothing at all to do with HMRC. It was a sort of reuse of a business model that had already been seen to be unsuccessful because the business had gone through insolvency. In the grand scheme of sort of seriousness, that in itself is not, a particularly sort of serious case for us to pursue. So, if you're asking me, what does that 6 or 7 cases tell us about our efforts to deal with repeat abuse of the tax regime, not paying over taxes, collecting taxes in and using that for other purposes other than paying the HMRC? I would say that doesn't really tell us anything about our performance there. However, the 6,000 plus disqualifications we've taken, a large proportion of those cases will have unpaid taxes in them, whether it's in a single company or whether it's in multiple companies. Some cases we absolutely still do lead on trading to the detriment of the Crown allegation. We did 140 of those cases last year, so that's our lead allegation. Now that, for us, if it's in 2 companies, successive companies, that's an aggravating factor. That may mean that the person receives a 6-year disqualification rather than a 4-year disqualification. But in terms of the actual substance of the misconduct is that you have in some way failed with your duties to collect in and pay over taxes, and that's what you're expected to do. And you have done that in a way that demonstrates a particular sort of intent. So you may have paid all of your other creditors, but you haven't been paying your tax liabilities. And therefore, we would lead on that trading to the detriment of the Crown allegation. So it doesn't appear in our publications or in our enforcement data as a Phoenix case. Some of them will have been multiple failures, repeat behaviour. Some of them will be single company cases.
If I might interrupt, the Chair gave a very good example of the numbers we're talking about when it comes to these sort of rogue directors and phony companies. We are talking about thousands and thousands. So that's why the number 7 is particularly shocking. to be honest, I think the number 6,274 isn't a huge amount better. When we know that this is an industrial industry, the numbers are huge when it comes to the number of phony companies and rogue directors behind them. These stories have been in the newspapers for a very long time about fictitious companies, made-up people, Mickey Mouse being in charge, all the rest of it. We all know it all too well. So going back to my initial point, can you please give us some concrete guarantees about how you're going to measure performance about going after these rogue directors, particularly on the grounds of phoenixism? And also, can you please give us any sort of clear idea about the fact that these numbers are not acceptable and they're not particularly good when it comes to performance, but what would good numbers actually look like as far as you're concerned?
So we want to increase the number of enforcement outcomes that we achieve across all of the types of outcome, whether that's a prosecution, and we prosecute for a range of insolvency and company law offences. We also do a significant amount of work gathering, analysing and sharing intelligence, some of that going into the wider sort of community of law enforcement organisations that tackle economic crime. We do that through our membership of the National Economic Crime Centre. And some of the companies that you're talking about, these sort of fictitious sham companies that are set up for nothing other than a nefarious purpose, we have shared a significant amount of intelligence that has helped other law enforcement agencies to take action. But I think in terms of our own sort of activities here, we have a whole range of new offences under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that we will be pursuing in collaboration with Companies House. And across our three organisations, following the NAO report, we have set up an action group that is currently working on a plan in response to the NAO report that will include doing more disqualification work, more publicity around Phoenix cases that maybe has been lacking in the past. We've got a directors information hub that we use to try and help directors to avoid.
If I might press back to my original question, what would good look like and what would those numbers look like? Because I don't think that the numbers that are in this report, either the figure of 7 specific cases where it has been a Phoenix case, or that other figure of 6,274 are good numbers, and I certainly hope you don't think they are. So what would good look like, and when are we going to get there? It is a really short question, so a really clear answer would be fantastic.
It's very difficult for me to say. As I say, we disqualified 1,222 directors last year. That was 300, about 30% more than we'd done the previous year. We want to continue to increase our numbers of successful disqualifications and other enforcement. Our total sort of range of enforcement outcomes, prosecutions, etc., is around 2,300 in total. Last year. We want to do more. We want to be more productive. We want to utilise technology to do more. I can't put a particular figure on it because that will be determined by the level of activity that's going on in the economy, the sort of cases that are coming to us that are suitable for us. Many will be suitable for other enforcement agencies to pursue, whether it's HMRC or the NCA or the police, etc. But we will, we'll be contributing increasingly, I think, to that work to tackle economic crime across the piece going forwards, both through the new offences under the ECTA and implementing new technology over the next couple of years that enable us to be more productive with the resources that we have.
So Jim, as this is an area of cross-organisation working, have you got a clearer idea of what HMRC would think good looks like in this area, and whether or not there would be any sort of figures or time frame for when you might deliver good?
Yes, so I mean, we clearly want to get the losses from abuse of, whether it be insolvency or company dissolutions, down. We have in 2024 invested in a new insolvency case management system to help us with that, and better risking capability. And I've got 627 people in my insolvency practice working to ensure that insolvency is used correctly in relation to tax and is not abused. The Chancellor did announce at the budget that she wants to see greater cooperation between our three organisations, and we are working on an implementation plan to deliver that, which we will obviously share with the National Audit Office as part of our response to their report.
Thank you, Sir Jim. That's really helpful. Rebecca, Paul, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we're going to move on to electronic sales suppression now. And so it was in 2016, I believe, that you sort of identified a form of ESS that was resulting in significant tax losses, and then you looked again at 2019 and found that the loss was much more than you thought, so it was 450 million per year, and a strategy then came out of that in 2019, and then it was 2022 where new powers were granted. It seems to have taken quite a long time to sort of address this issue and take action. So what is it behind that slowness? Can you explain to us? So, and that's probably to Ms. Ciniewicz, please.
Sure. So it's a complex, it's a technical area, and it's one where obviously the software, particularly if it's electronic sales suppression software that's in use, and obviously sales suppression isn't necessarily a product of the use of this kind of software. It can also be the use of legitimate functions in a till, like training software to hide income and sales, and we are working really to understand both the technologies that lie behind that and to make, to investigate into the use of those technologies at the same time as, sharing intelligence internationally as well with our international partners like the J5, who, we work closely with. We have been tackling it through a range of different interventions, and including investigating criminally. We have made 8 arrests in 2 cases in relation to the providers and suppliers of electronic sales suppression. And in one of those cases, 2 individuals involved with the supply of ESS have been charged, and the trial will begin next October. In the second case, no further action in relation to those criminal charges is being taken due to some of the factors in the case, but we are now looking at the use of the civil powers that you mentioned. We've also got cases under consideration for criminal investigation into providers of electronic point of sale materials, and we've also got active criminal investigations into end users of those technologies. So there is quite a lot of work going on, not necessarily visibly at the moment. In parallel with that, we've also been using some of our other tools, which are what we call our one-to-many work, which is where we've contacted over 5,500 businesses and asked them to make a declaration into relation to their use or not. And we are working through those responses. We've got active investigations going on, and we are also following up on other risk and intelligence reports relating to the use of ESS and investigating those cases. And we think we will have, again, some cases delivering some yield from that, from some tax, additional tax.
Thank you. I think it's reassuring to hear about the arrests. And in terms of the sort of civil powers, when do you anticipate starting to use those more routinely?
Well, so we are, I think, we clearly these particular types of activity, we do take them seriously. So our first port of call to date has been, as I say, the exploration of criminal prosecution. But I think in those cases where that doesn't prove to be the best route forward, then we will be looking, and I think in the near future, at the use of those civil powers.
Thank you. And Sir Jim, you plan to update the estimates of the tax loss from ESS this month, I think, was the time frame given. Do you now have those new estimates, or when can we expect to see those?
I think that's due in spring, this 2025.
It's now spring 2025.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want me to move on to?
Please. Yep.
19? Okay. So we're now moving on. HMRC has reduced its use of prosecutions, and so we've seen the number of prosecutions resulting from HMRC's criminal investigations has reduced from 749 in 2018-19 to 344 in 2023-24. So just sort of interested to Ms Ciniewicz in your perspective on the impact on deterrent effect of that reduction in prosecutions.
So I think at a previous hearing of the committee you heard about some of the work that we're doing to understand the deterrent effects in a kind of evidence-based way. I mean, clearly we have reduced the number of criminal prosecutions in that period, although I would say that, you know, our sort of first line measure, which we call positive charging decisions, which is the number of cases that we take to the Crown Prosecution Service or other prosecuting authorities, is increasing again. So we had over 500 positive charging decisions last year, and obviously that's the beginning of the pipeline for a prosecution, which may come further down the road. So we are increasing the number of positive charging decisions. I don't expect them to necessarily hit the level that you described at the start, but we look to make the most effective use of those powers. And what we are seeing is that both in the more than 10,000 civil cases that my Fraud Investigation Service takes forward, as well as the criminal investigations, we're seeing, I think, a much higher average value return in terms of the tax at risk that we're investigating. And we think that the focus of those powers, particularly the criminal powers, on the most egregious forms of non-compliance is in itself a deterrent effect. And certainly you've seen some very high-profile cases in the last year. And I think that does send a message out about our seriousness in taking on some of the most sophisticated offenders using those criminal powers.
Thank you. I mean, I can see that one of the sort of strategies you've been taking is to identify groups of businesses and sort of send a letter out to them, if you think, their revenue is looking too low. So how effective has that been in your view in terms of
we use a whole range of techniques to improve compliance, and they can range from things like digital nudges and prompts in our online services. We use data and intelligence to perhaps, if we can identify potential non-compliance where we think people's returns might not be in line with what we might expect them to be, and give them the opportunity to correct. And we also do a full range of one-to-one interventions, and last year overall we opened over 310,000 individual investigations across my departments. And all of that together, I think, comes, there's a whole spectrum then of interactions with HMRC that hopefully help the people who want to comply to get their tax right, but also treat very seriously those people who are seeking to deliberately evade their tax, and will take that process very seriously, particularly those cases, those 10,000 or so cases that are investigated by the Fraud Investigation Service.
Thank you.
Jim, just on this subject, in my final question, that table on page 49, figure 15, is quite stark on the subject of reduction in prosecutions, pre-COVID and post-COVID. And you'll be aware that this committee has been concerned about this drop in prosecutions and the deterrent effect that it might have. And indeed, I think in your Treasury Minute, you agreed with us that this might be the case. So if you agreed with us, what are you going to do to ensure that this number of prosecutions is going to be increased in future?
Yeah, so first of all, you're right. I mean, prosecutions have been depressed, not just in relation to tax offences, but in relation, I think, more generally, following the pandemic. But we are seeing an increase in the number of positive charging decisions that we are getting from the prosecuting authorities, and hopefully that will follow through. Whilst we have a strategy of focusing our criminal investigations on the more serious fraud since 2019, which is reflected in the fact, for example, that the proportion of convictions that
get a custodial sentence has increased from about 35% in the 4 years up to 2020 to nearly 50% in the 4 years since then. We do want to increase the overall volume that we carry out, and we are increasing the size of our fraud investigation service. So it's already increased. It was about 4,400 people in 2018-19. It's about 4,800 now. It will go up to 5,400 by 2029-30 with the additional resources that we've been given. And I would expect that to result in an increase both in the volume of criminal investigations and prosecutions we see, but also the sort of serious end of the civil interventions we make as well.
Luke, Charteris, you had another question?
Yeah, just a theme for me, if I can be so candid, is just in the answers a lack of join-up when it comes to these challenges, because at the end of the day, be it VAT, incorporation, insolvency, it's often the same fraudsters, the same criminals. Can you just give some assurance about what the future vision for collaboration looks like, be that in terms of sharing data in prosecutions? Can you just give this committee a bit more confidence about the level of join-up between your organisations?
I mean, I'll let Dean and Louise come in. I mean, from my point of view, first of all, under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, we very much welcome the steps that Companies House are taking under that Act. We are supporting them to implement it. We're also working closely with them on our investment bids for the spending review to try and get as much value as we can as a tax authority from the registration work, that sort of joint registration work that we can do. And we have been helping Louise's organisation to cleanse the register and sort of develop its capabilities to support it to implement the Act. In the case of the abuse of insolvency and dissolution to evade tax, we are, we've got our own strategy within HMRC for what we do about that, but we are committed to improving
your own
the
strategy,
collaboration.
But I'm wanting confidence about
so
joined-up strategy.
So,
here.
I mean, as the Chancellor announced in our budget, we are committed to improving the collaboration between our three organisations on that. And, over the remainder of this financial year, we'll be developing the sort of concrete plan to do that.
So I support that, and I think the introduction of the Act, which enabled us to have greater data sharing powers, means that we can capitalise much more on how we can work together to tackle some of this. So, but we have been working closely together. I think there's always more that you can do, and we have joint interests and joint aims that I think we can exploit.
I think I'd just add, at an operational level, we do work very, very closely every single day across a range of fronts in our casework. We wound up a company in the public interest last month where there'd been false accounts filed, there'd been a failure to pay over tax. We had the initial complaint from trading standards around the supply from China of substandard products. Getting information, working together across the piece. We've taken that business out of the marketplace. It's now in our public interest unit for an investigation. I think going forwards, for me, I think there's having the working on this joint strategy, I think will be a real positive move. I think the more we can share data from across the organisations, particularly to help early intervention activities, whether that's by us, whether that's by HMRC, that gives the best opportunity to even nip sort of egregious behaviours in the bud, or at least maximise the opportunities to recover value, to recover taxes that are due before it gets to the insolvency state.
Well, on that really important note, and I note your very aspirational answers, all three of you. We will be following that with great interest to make sure it's translated into real action. But this has been a really illuminating session. We've covered a lot of ground. So Sir Jim and the other witnesses from the Insolvency Service, from Companies House and Penny Ciniewicz, thank you all very, very much. You've spent a lot of time today and we've appreciated it. Order, order.